Hi, friends of more of Management of Reality. This is our weekly English language podcast, and today the topic is what is Noahide civilization? And well, first thing we need to talk about is what does it mean to be a Noahide? What does that even mean? And the simplest answer is that a Noahide means son of Noah. So in Hebrew, the category Noahide is rendered B'nai Noach, which means the children of Noah. This is Noah of the flood, that Noah, right? So what does it mean to be a child of Noah? What it means is that you are committed to following the 7 laws of Noah. Okay, that's what it means. In other words, the covenant you accept is not the full Torah, not the 613 laws, plus all of the derivations that have been made of those laws in Talmudic jurisprudence and the Halakha. That's not the covenant you're making. You're just, if you're a Noahide, you're committing to following the 7 laws of Noah. Okay, that's what the category is. And this is a category that I'll get to what the laws are in a second. But this is a category that was created by the rabbis so that the nations of the world, the non-Jews, can be made to participate in Judaism with the Jews as one larger community, even when they don't convert to Judaism. Okay, so it's a very kind of a open to the world kind of attitude that Judaism has. You can still convert to Judaism if you want. That's more difficult, but it's possible for those who want to do it. But what the Noahide category does is it creates a kind of an intermediate relationship with the Torah for the peoples of the world, for the nations of the world, when people don't feel like converting to Judaism, right? So you might feel that, well, I'm not sure that I want to follow all of the commandments that are, regulation for religious Jews. You may feel personally that that's not for you, that's it's too much for you, or it's not your kind of thing. Fine, but if you still believe that the Torah is the book of God and that the Jews are God's holy people, or at any rate, you believe that the movement of the Torah is the thing that you want to do in this world, right? You want to join the movement of the Torah. Well, you can become a Noahide without becoming a Jew. And the moment you become a Noahide, you are joining the Torah movement. You are joining the Jewish people without becoming a Jew. All right, this is it's a way of creating an additional way of relating to the Torah and to the Jewish people and to be included in Judaism without having to go through the step of conversion. Which, from the point of view of the rabbis, what they were trying to do is they're trying to make salvation, that is to say, the joining with the Jews in the project to make life ethical, right? That's what salvation means from the point of from the Jewish perspective. It means joining the Jews in their exploration of ethics to make the world peaceful, right? That's what you're doing when you join the Torah movement. from the perspective of the rabbis, the Noahide movement is a way of including all of us who don't want to be Jews, but who do want to be part of the Torah movement with the Jews, right? This is how we can be included. And it shows a tremendous openness on the part of the rabbis as part of the original effort of Judaism, of the Jewish people on this earth, to be a light unto the nations, right? As the book of Isaiah says. The Jews are to be a light unto the nations. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Jewish people is responsible for transmitting generation after generation the text of the Torah and the law that grows out of the Torah in a constantly growing and evolving exploration of the ethical life, right? In order to benefit humanity with a science of how to live in peace, right? This is what the Jewish people has been doing all of these centuries on this planet. And as a result of the work of the Jewish people, in fact, Western civilization has improved tremendously. I'm going to come back to that in a second when I talk about what Noahide civilization means. But before I do that, I want just to make clear what it is that Noahides are committing to, and just I'll make the relevant disclosure before we go any further. I myself am a Noahide, and I recently went through the formal ceremony of the profession of Noahide faith in the court of Rabbi Uri Shirky in Jerusalem. Rabbi Uri Shirky is, the rabbi to the worldwide Noahide movement. And I was very fortunate. I'm very fortunate to know him, and I admire Rabbi Shirky. I think he's a great man, and it was a wonderful experience to do the right in his court, to be received as a Noahide by the Jewish people. Okay, so what was I committing to? Let me put it on the screen now. Okay. So I am putting on the screen the 7 laws of Noah. And they are called that because the rabbis find a way of deriving these from what is written in Genesis in the period before Noah, up to and including Noah, right? And so the laws that the rabbis identify there are the following: the prohibition of idolatry, not to worship idols, which in its let us say more interesting interpretation, the one I like the most, it's not merely about not worshiping idols, but about not doing what worshiping idols metaphorically stands for more generally, which is you may not construct any principle of authority above your own conscience, above your own consciousness. Okay? You have to think for yourself. You can't turn something else or some other person or some institution or some other text or some other tradition or whatever. You can't turn anything into an idol. You can't turn anything into a source of authority that will short circuit your own critical ethical thinking. Okay? Why? Because Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So they and all of their descendants, including you and me, therefore know the difference between good and evil, right? Of course, these are all metaphors, but at least I believe they are. But they are metaphors that speak to this point. You know the difference between good and evil. You have this capacity. But if you allow anything that is not your own consciousness to be the source of authority over what is good and what is evil, then you're no longer thinking. You're transferring responsibility for deciding what is good and what is evil to this other authority. And then you can't be ethical. You can only be ethical when you are responsible. And that's why this commandment is so important, because the Noahide laws are the basic are the basic principles of ethics. So this is what the Jewish people are requiring us, members of the nations, to commit to in order to be part of the Torah community. We have to be committing to the basic principles of ethics. But you can't do that if you abandon your own critical, conscious thinking. Can't do that. You cannot be ethical. Okay? So this is the first of the 7 commandments, just as it is also the first of the famous commandments that Moses gives to the Jewish people, right? Now, the prohibition of blasphemy, right? Not to curse the name of God. Well, you need respect for God because God is the giver of the law that then serves as the basis for the Jewish exploration of ethics, right? So if you can't maintain a respectful relationship with God, then you won't be respecting God's product, which is the law, and therefore you also, in the end, cannot be ethical. If you have no respect for the law that makes us ethical, you can't be ethical. So that chain of respect begins with respect for the lawgiver, and that's God. Okay, so this is, once again, there's a functional link here to sustaining an ethical equilibrium, which is what this exploration, what the Jewish exploration is all about. And then we get into specific ways of being ethical, right? Prohibition of murder. Now notice it's prohibition of murder, of homicide, which is it's not the same thing as thou shalt not kill, which is how this is usually rendered in Shakespearean English in a lot of translations. It is not you may not kill, it is you may not commit homicide. In other words, you may kill in self-defense if others are coming to kill you, right? And in fact, there's a famous Talmudic statement of this, which says, if somebody is coming to kill you, rise up early and kill him first, right? So the prohibition is against homicide. In self-defense, of course, we are allowed to kill because we have a primary ethical obligation to our own selves. And therefore, if someone is coming to kill us, it becomes permissible for us to kill. Other than that, of course, we may not kill because there is nothing more serious than to deprive a human being of their life. You take everything, forgive me, you take everything away from them, right? It's an infinite cost. Then we have prohibition of forbidden sexual relations. Now, this goes straight to the protection of the family, all right? So forbidden sexual relations are those sexual relations that make it difficult to have stable families, all right? So part of the ethical system that Judaism is trying to sustain is a world without sexual deprivation, because sexual deprivation it disintegrates the family. Okay. Then you have prohibition of theft. That refers to obviously respecting another's property. Okay, and therefore should be also understood as the prohibition of communism, because communism is based on theft, right? And then you have prohibition of eating flesh from a living animal. Now, as an anthropologist, this makes me think that it must have been true that in the ancient world there were societies where people were doing this, because it's difficult to imagine that you would forbid this if it were irrelevant, right? Now, I don't know that anybody's doing this today, but the let us say the obvious sense of this commandment is to forbid cruelty to animals, which is commonsensically ethical, right? So we can, I think the interpretation that we should be compassionate towards animals because they have the capacity to suffer is the obvious modern retrofit for this particular commandment. And finally, we have the seventh law, which is very interesting. It says obligation to establish courts of justice to enforce the law. In other words, well, you're not going to be a Jew if you're a Noahide, but you're still going to need a legal system. You're still going to need to adjudicate disputes peacefully, because the entire point is for humans to live peacefully. That's what the Torah is about. This is why the Jews greet and say goodbye with the word peace, shalom. And it's why they're always talking about peace, peace this, peace that, shalom aleichem, peace be with you all. So you're going to need courts. Can't live in peace if you don't have peaceful mechanisms of dispute resolution. So you're not going to be Jewish if you're a Noahide, which means you're not going to be following all of the laws that have been developed for the Jews. You're going to have your own. So what the Noahide system is saying is each nation can have their own system of law. It doesn't have to be like the Jewish system of law. Make it your own. But whatever system of law you develop, it has to be consistent with the other 6 Noahide laws. Okay, so it has to be consistent with the basic principles of ethics and with the search for an ethical, peaceful life with one's neighbors. All right. Okay, so now let me get out of here. So now that we've discussed what it means to be a Noahide and what it entails from the from the point of view of the commitment that you're making, what do I mean by Noahide civilization? Now, a Noahide civilization, if you're parting from first principles, right, from the definition of what a Noahide is, what would a Noahide civilization look like by definition? Well, it would be a civilization where pretty much everybody in it thinks that the Torah is the book of God, that the Jews are the holy people of God, chosen by God to be a light unto the nations and help all of us move from savagery into an ethical life of peace and brotherhood, right? This is the justice, peace, and brotherhood, all the good stuff. So if you have a Noahide civilization, it means that basically everybody's following the Torah, in the sense, not necessarily in the sense of following all of the laws in the Torah, because in a Noahide civilization, most people will not be Jews, right? But everybody's following the Torah in the sense that everybody recognizes the Torah as the highest authority, and the special place of the Jews, and everybody sees themselves as included in the Jewish movement, even when they haven't converted to Judaism, right? And of course, there's a special place of respect for the rabbis as our leaders in the search for an ethical life, right? So all of that is true in a Noahide civilization. And obviously, in a Noahide civilization, the Jewish literature is going to be very important. The Jewish religious literature is going to have a very important special place, even if the system of law is one that any particular Noahide nation has chosen for their particular situation, right? But consistent with the laws of Noah. Okay. Well, modern Western civilization is in many ways already that. In many ways. Why? Because modern Western civilization was built by Christians for the most part. Okay? Christians are by far the most numerous religious category in the West, and it was therefore mostly Christians who built these modern Western nation states, these democratic Western nation states. Now, a Christian is someone who believes the Torah was authored by God, okay? Because the sacred religious literature of the Jews, up to and including all of Tanakh, in other words, what is usually called the Hebrew Bible, right? All of that is included as a sacred text in the Christian tradition. And though Christians believe that a new religious dispensation was transmitted through Jesus, that doesn't mean that the earlier books are not of divine origin from the Christian perspective. They still are. And moreover, in the Christian tradition, the ethical values are inherited from Judaism. So, for example, we have that very importantly, Jesus was very fond of saying that love your brother, love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is the commandment Leviticus 19:18, was the grammatical engine, if you will, for producing the entire Jewish law and the entire point of Jewish law. Okay? Everything in Judaism had to be consistent with love your neighbor as you, with the commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself, according to Jesus. Now, this is not original with Jesus. It's very important, and Jesus's influence was tremendous. So that particular message reached many people through the tradition that held Jesus up as the leader, which is Christianity, right? All of that is true. But the idea that everything in the law of God and everything in human relations has to be consistent with love your neighbor as you love yourself, that idea is not original with Jesus. That principle was enunciated by the Rabbi Hillel the Elder in the first century before Jesus. And Jesus of Nazareth was obviously, working within the tradition that Hillel the Elder started, within Hillel's movement, right? So Jesus agrees with Hillel the Elder and repeats the message that Hillel the Elder made so important. And through Jesus, many people later get it, right? It has a huge impact on Western civilization. But it is not a new message. This is important. This is not a new message. It's already a message that is central to Judaism, in fact, because Hillel the Elder is the most important rabbi in the Jewish tradition of jurisprudence. Hillel the Elder is the origin of the Mishnah, which is the core of the Talmud, where Jewish jurisprudence happens, right? Where the Jewish oral law is developed and extended. So if everything is based on Hillel's thought, right? Hillel's thought is what generates the entire tradition of Jewish jurisprudence. And if Hillel's basic principle is that everything has to be anchored in love your neighbor as you love yourself, well, then what we see is that Judaism and Christianity basically share one central core generative grammatical ethical principle. Okay? Love your neighbor as you love yourself unites Judaism and Christianity in the generative structure of their ethical system. Okay? Christianity gets it from Judaism. So, modern Western civilization, based on Christian values, is therefore based on Jewish values. Values that are acquired from the Jewish tradition on the authority of the Jewish tradition, right? Well, that's basically what Noahides do. Noahides learn ethics from the Jews on the authority of Jewish religious literature. Okay. So, what happened in modern Western civilization is that although it took many, many centuries finally to get there, in modern Western civilization, that is to say, with the mental revolution that was the Enlightenment, which then led to political revolutions, right? What finally happened in the West after many centuries is that the values of Judaism were finally established and embodied in our institutions. Okay, so now we have in the modern West institutions that extend human rights to all citizens, that extend political participation to all citizens. We have constitutions to limit the power of the people in government. We have parliaments and separation of powers, and so on and so forth. All of these things are already included in Jewish law, right? The idea of separation of powers is in Jewish law. The idea of limiting the power of the king with law is in Jewish law. The idea of human rights is in Jewish law. All of this we get from the much older Jewish tradition, right? So modern Western civilization is the civilization produced by non-Jews who see in the Jewish tradition an expression of divine will, and who take the complex of ethical principles and the generative, the grammatically generative core principle, all of that, take it from the Jewish tradition. Well, they're not technically Noahides because they're Christians, which means that they think the Jews are wrong in the sense of not accepting Jesus, right? So in that sense, Christian theology debunks the authority of the Jews in that sense. But other than that, Christians are basically accepting the ethical package of Judaism without following the entirety of Jewish laws and without converting to Judaism, right? So modern Western civilization is basically Noahide, right? To make it technically Noahide, the Christians would have to renounce their mystical relationship with the figure of Jesus as, Son of God and Redeemer. They would have to reject their identification of Jesus of Nazareth with the Messiah expected by the Jews. And if they did that, then they would be Noahides also in the technical sense, right? But let us say, basically, what we have in modern Western, in the modern Western world is a Noahide civilization. And I really want to emphasize this point because modern Western civilization is a much better place than the other kinds of societies that we've had in the West. So if you go back to the Middle Ages, you'll see how much worse it was. Just read up a little bit on the Middle Ages and you'll see that our ancestors were living in a totalitarian society. That's what we call the Inquisition. People couldn't disagree with the Pope. If you thought a thought that was different from what the Pope had authorized, you could be burned alive. It was a very serious thing. So everybody was basically a slave. It was a totalitarian system. And if you go further back into antiquity, you encountered different kinds of totalitarian systems, but you don't escape totalitarianism. In fact, in many ways, ancient classical societies were even worse than medieval society, right? So I know that in school they told you that Athens invented democracy, but that's a tremendous educational and pedagogical lie. It's just a lie. The ancient Athenians, according to a census done by Demetrius of Phalerum, who governed the Athenian Empire in the 4th century BC, there were 400,000 slaves in the Athenian Empire. There were only 20,000 citizens. 400,000 slaves. Think about that. And at least tens of thousands of those slaves were treated with the most sadistic brutality imaginable, because they were made to work in the mines of Laurion, south of Athens. These were silver mines that produced tremendous wealth for Athens. And so they had tens of thousands of slaves there. You know, they whipped them over and over again to force them to go into the earth until they dropped dead. So these were death camps. The mines of Laurion were death camps. That was Greek society. And in Roman society, which was also brimming with slaves that, as in Greek society, were crucified if they complained or if they tried to escape, literally crucified. In Rome, they also invented the idea of sadism as mass entertainment, as a kind of sport. So starting in the 1st century, they started building these wooden stadiums all over Italy because the gladiator contests became all the rage. The Roman elite, the few people who voted and who had citizenship and who lorded it over this giant population of slaves, got it into their heads that it would be fun to watch some of these slaves fight to the death, or to watch how African beasts would eat them alive. Ancient societies of the West, the classical Greco-Roman societies, were frankly psychopathic. Don't let your professors tell you that what those societies did was somehow okay or shouldn't be judged because they were ancient, as if ethics were something that was only invented in the last couple of hundred centuries. Forgive me, in the last couple of hundred years, what I meant to say, the last couple of centuries. Don't let your profs tell you that. It just isn't true. The Jews were there in the ancient world teaching ethics. So even if you couldn't come up with that yourself, you could just listen to the Jews and get it. And a lot of people did. And this is the crucial thing to understand about the West and how we got to Noahide civilization in the West, to modern Noahide civilization. Because in the ancient world, when Greco-Roman societies came into contact with the Jews, because many Jews began settling in the Mediterranean basin starting in the 2nd century before Jesus, okay? So the Greco-Roman peoples of the Mediterranean basin came into contact with the Jews, and that transformed them. People got very excited with Judaism. Why? Because they were downtrodden slaves. And what the God of the Jews was saying to them was that God is on the side of the slaves. The book of Exodus is the story of a slave revolt. And it's from that slave revolt that emanates Jewish law, right? It's in the context of bringing the slaves out into the Sinai desert, into freedom, that Moses gives the Jewish people a new law. That's the political context in which the law of Moses appears. It's a slave revolt, right? So the abused slaves of the ancient Greco-Roman world were very excited to come in contact with Judaism, with the movement that was abolishing slavery, that was showing people that they could be free, that had an entire system of law developed to protect everybody's human rights. Well, that was very exciting. So many, many people in the ancient Mediterranean world converted to Judaism. On this point, there is zero controversy. We have abundant historical testimonies of this process from the Romans, from the Jews, from the Christians. Everybody talked about this. Okay? Thousands and thousands and thousands of people converted to Judaism in the 2 centuries before Jesus and in the 2 centuries after Jesus. It was a tremendous social phenomenon. But an even bigger population, even bigger than the thousands and thousands of people converting to Judaism, were the Noahides. So in the ancient world, they were called God-fearers. So these were people who recognized that the Torah movement was very important and joined the Torah movement in different ways without converting to Judaism. They began adopting some of the most important Jewish laws, like, for example, the Sabbath. This is very common among Noahides, is to keep the Sabbath. I, for example, do it. Many other Noahides do so too. So many people started keeping the Sabbath without converting to Judaism, and they would go to the synagogues on the Sabbath. The synagogues were open to the pagans. There was a special place where they had to sit, separate from the Jews, but they were welcome, could come in, listen to the reading of the law. And some of them would take the plunge, right? Some of them would convert, but many did not. It was a huge movement, huge Noahide movement. You take these two things together, and you're talking about a giant political problem for the Roman Empire, because Jewish law is fundamentally opposed to Roman law. Roman law is the law of an oppressor class, whereas Jewish law is the law of a slave revolt. Okay, so these were fundamentally opposed, and it became a huge problem for the Roman Empire. And we've been writing about that in the series Semitism versus Antisemitism on Management of Reality, if you're interested in that topic. So if you go to the front page, I'll show you. If you go to the front page and you, oh, I haven't opened this. Let me see. Let me open it first. So if you go to the front page and you look at the most popular articles, which are on the right, I know I'm not showing you anything yet. Hold on. There we go. No, that's not it. Hold on. Okay. Forgive me. I'm always very slow with this. Now you're seeing my screen, and that's the front page. So on the right-hand side, we have the most popular articles. If you scroll down, you will see this one, Semitism versus Anti-Semitism. If you click on that, I don't know why it's not. Oh, there we go. If you click on that, you'll see the series. It's not finished. I've published a few articles in this series, and that series is trying to make you see all of Western history. In fact, all of the history of Western Asia, not just Europe and its descendant societies, but all of Western Asia as part of one big political system that has been coherently struggling between two rival movements that I call Semitism and anti-Semitism for 4,300 years. And within that structure, I place Judaism as the most exquisite product of Semitism. Okay, what I'm calling Semitism. Semitism is the larger movement in search of an ethical life that began in Mesopotamia 4,300 years ago, even before Judaism began making its mark in history. And that is let us say, the cultural stream from which Judaism emerged as the most exquisite product of Semitism. Okay, so in today's world, Semitism continues in the West as the Judeo-Christian tradition, and its most accomplished social and political product is modern Western civilization, modern democratic Western civilization, or what I'm here calling Noahide civilization. All right. And I think this is a very important development. Noahide civilization is very, very important. It's revolutionary because it means that the nations of the West have finally institutionalized the values of Judaism. Okay. The books have been sacred for a long time to Christians, but the values contained in those books, the Jewish values contained in those books, have not been institutionalized throughout our history, or not fully. That is a very recent development. Okay, it's a consequence of the European Enlightenment and the modern revolutions. Because of those things, because of the modern revolutions, we finally instituted human rights for all, political participation for all, divided government to protect us, and so on and so forth. Right? And I think it's clear that the continued exploration of an ethical life within the confines of Noahide civilization is what the West needs. And as the West slips out of that framing, as we've been seeing the West do in the last few decades, everything starts to fall apart. We are in danger of collapse. It's a very dangerous moment for Westerners right now. And what's happening can be described as Westerners moving out, helter-skelter. Different parts of the West have been moving out of the frame, of the Noahide frame. And this is what's breaking us. Okay. So I want to make a strong point that coming back to the Torah and becoming true Noahides, or as true Noahides as we can as we move forward, is the way to save the West. All right, I'm supposed to be looking at the questions. Let me see what we got. So Yoel is telling me we have a question. Let me see if I can see them here. How do I see the questions? I'm supposed to. Here we go. Okay, so one question is, why is it that there is so much hatred against the Jews? What is the basis of hatred against the Jews if what they're bringing to us is the search for an ethical life? All right, this is a great question. I've answered it in many places. I always get asked this question, but I never tire of giving the answer because the answer is profound. And it goes back to the origin of the law of Moses in a slavery world. Okay, this is the key. The key is that the law of Moses has its origin in the political context of a slave revolt. Because that's the political origin in a slave revolt means that the law of Moses is designed to help you fight and keep your freedom. Fight for and keep your freedom. Okay? That's what the law of Moses is for. It's a law to fight against oppression, to abolish slavery, to ensure that everybody is equal under the law. that nobody is trampled on. So obviously, if you are trying to enslave everybody, if you would like everyone to be your slave, the way the Roman aristocracy wished for us all to be slaves, right? If you're that kind of power monger, that kind of ruler, that kind of oppressor, well, then you're going to find the Jewish movement to be a thorn in your side, right? You're not going to be very happy to see the Jews come and give your slaves ideas, teach them that they can be free, that God is on their side if they launch a slave revolt. You're not going to find that comfortable. To the contrary, if you're an oppressor who wants to make everyone a slave, you will see in the Jewish movement an immediate threat to the entire system that you're trying to put together or keep together. So the slavers, the people who want to make slaves of us all, they've always mobilized propaganda against the Jews to turn everyone into an anti-Semite, so that the populations that would have been liberated by the Jews will instead collaborate with the elite effort to destroy the Jews. And in this way, they get people to cooperate with their own slavery. Okay, that's what anti-Semitism is for. Anti-Semitism is an ideological tool, the function of which is to destroy the Jews so that the people who want to enslave you can put the chains on you. And if you look at the history of the West, it is very clear every single time, because this is an amazing thing. This is a pattern without exceptions. It's a very powerful thing, a pattern without exceptions. And not any pattern, it's a pattern with tremendous consequences for political life in Western civilization, right? And in Islamic civilization. What is the pattern I'm talking about? That the people who organize mass killings of Jews every century are the same people enslaving all of the nations of the West. Okay? Now think about it. The jihadis are the ones organizing mass killings of Jews today. And they say out loud that they're going to either kill us or enslave us. All of us, all Westerners. They want to destroy the West as we know it. And they organize enormous mass killings of Jews. So there you have the jihadis. Then you have the Nazis in the 20th century. Well, the Nazis enslaved everybody. First people they enslaved were the Germans. I recommend you watch any movie depicting the social life of Germans under the Nazis, and the way even people from the Nazi party interacted with each other. And you'll see that even members of the Nazi party were slaves. Everybody was scared to death to say the wrong thing or appear to be pro-Jewish or voice an incorrect opinion, something that the Führer didn't like or whatever, because they could be sent to the concentration camp and executed on a whim. Everybody was a slave, starting with the Germans, starting with the members of the Nazi party. Some slaves suffered more than others, right? Certainly, but everybody was a slave. Well, those people organized an enormous mass killing of Jews, right? Keep going back, it's the same thing every time. The Russian boyars organized pogroms against the Jews. Everybody was enslaved, pretty much, in the Russian Tsarist Empire. Go back, the Inquisition, everybody was a slave under the Inquisition, like we just got saying. And yes, the Inquisition was organizing enormous mass killings of Jews. Keep going back, you got the Romans, and further back the Greco-Macedonians, and in both cases, you're talking about power elites that organized genocides of the ancient Jews, okay? And they were enslaving everybody. So we have a perfectly consistent pattern that matches the explanation I'm giving you. The reason for the elite production of anti-Semitic propaganda, because it's always very well financed from the top. The reason for the elite production of anti-Semitic propaganda designed to turn everybody into an anti-Semite is that they want to enslave me, the Goy, the non-Jew, the member of the nations. That's why they mobilize hatred against the Jews. It makes sense. They don't want people becoming attracted to Judaism because in discovering the ethical treasure that is Judaism, because if people do that, they'll fight for their own freedom, they'll respect themselves, they will insist on their human rights, they will demand that the powerful be limited in their power by law, and so on and so forth. And that's what the people at the very top who want to make us all slaves don't want. They don't want us to be free. So that's the reason. And that's why Noahide civilization, a true Noahide civilization, one that cannot be fooled into anti-Semitism because they are technical Noahides, and therefore they understand that the Torah is the most important book, that the Jews are the most important people, and that without the Torah and the Jewish people, we will be lost, right? That's a technically Noahide civilization. That one, that's a stable, peaceful place. You can't turn Noahides into anti-Semites. Very, very difficult, right? It's much easier if they already have prejudices against the Jews, right? But Noahides have a pro-Jewish, a basic pro-Jewish orientation, right? So there it's going to be a lot harder. So the path forward for the West, in my opinion, is the embracing of its Noahide identity, of its latent Noahide identity. I think that's the path forward. Now, I'm going to close now today's podcast, and those of you who are members, paid subscribers on Substack, you can come to the Q&A. If you are paid subscribers, or if you are not paid subscribers, if you're regular subscribers on Substack, you already got a email with the link, the Zoom link for the Q&A. Okay. If you're not a paid subscriber but would like to come to the Q&A, then there's a button there that you can click so that you can become a paid subscriber, and then you'll get the Zoom link, and we'll see you in the Q&A. Okay, go to your emails to see that email, and I'll see you soon, and I'll see you on the next podcast. And meanwhile, before you leave, just take a second to subscribe, to give a like, and think about sharing this video with others who might be interested in learning about this topic. We will return to this later because it's very dear to me. And soon we're going to publish the video of my Noahide induction ceremony so that we can all celebrate my formal change in status. All right. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.